Hey, Comics Cubers. Today we're talking to Zander Cannon, creator of Kaijumax, The Replacement God, Heck, and co creator of Top 10 with Alan Moore and Gene Ha. Zander is one of the most unique voices in the comics medium. Come join us. Welcome back to the Comics Cube. I am back with Zander Cannon. And the reason we're doing this is because the first two interviews we've had, we've realized we're on the same day each year. So we've decided to make an annual tradition out of it. How are you, Zander?
I'm great. How are you?
Doing all right. I'm doing all right. How have you been? The last time we spoke, Kaiju Max had just ended.
Yeah. Well, so yeah, so when I finished that, I was like, first of all, it was a huge relief, even though I missed the characters and it was a fun process. It's like it was so much to keep track of and so much work that I was really, relieved. And so I ended up just doing short projects for like basically this whole year. 6-page stories and illustrations and commissions and stuff. And it was kind of fun to be like to switch out of that sort of mode of having to keep these season-long stories going. But I'm also like, okay, now I'm tired of that. Now let's get back to doing a great big long story.
For people who don't know where to have found you this year, where were you this year?
Let's see. Well, there's an upcoming cryptid anthology from Ahoy Comics. There's the Xeno anthology, Xino, from Oni. Came out a couple months ago. Let's see. I had a short in 2000 AD, the full color sort of kid oriented one, and
Wait, there is a full color kid oriented 2000 AD.
There's news to me too.
I was gonna say there is a full color 2000 AD. There
Right?
is a kid oriented 2000 AD. There is the same. They're the same thing. What?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I know I'm blowing your mind, right? Left and right now. But yeah, I didn't know anything about it until basically we were in it, and and it's also magazine formatted, so I had to like reformat all the pages
Oh, okay.
because we did it not for anybody in particular, but with the sort of the US sort of comics ratio. So anyway,
Oh, okay.
yeah, and that was and so let's see, most of these I was working with collaborators. So Jeff Wessel with on the 2000 AD story. I worked with Gene Ha on the Ahoy cryptid story, and Alex Segura for the Xeno story. So yeah, it's fun. It's fun to be as a writer on some and artist on others, and so it's fun to collaborate again.
What a coincidence! Because my episode on the Comics Cube, as we speak, up right now, uploaded a couple hours ago, is Alex Segura.
Great.
And, and I had Gene on a couple months ago to talk about a comics fest. So people familiar with both of you
Right.
will always
All my
be happy.
pals. Yeah.
We'll always be happy to see the two of you working together. We're so glad that
Yeah.
the two of you are still working together.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah. Anytime Gene even like whispers, an idea like that, I'm like, yeah, let's do it. Just fun to work together.
That's really cool. I want to talk about that a little bit later, but can you mention what is this big long story that you're working on right now?
Oh, well, I mean, they're pitches I've got two science fiction pitches and a horror pitch that are kind of out and in the world, and people have expressed interest, but we're figuring out the details. And so but one thing that was nice is going from this multi-character, multi-storyline, full color, crazy sort of absurdist satire to like a very grounded, sort of desaturated, just 3-character horror pitch, and how sort of interesting that is, because it's like you have so much more time to spend with characters. You have so much more about what you don't see than it is about what you do see, and that was kind of fun to sort of get going on that, and not having it be, not that Kaijumax was exactly torn from the headlines, but I mean, not have it be sort of like pivoting along with sort of current events. It was more just like, it's a period piece, and so
Yeah.
yeah. So it was fun. It was fun to shift gears like that. Even though I haven't started working on the comics itself, but I've just been pitching.
No Hamilton references in this new one, I'm assuming.
Sad to say, there will be no Hamilton references.
There will be no full issues dedicated to riffing off of Hamilton.
Yeah, and no like 3 months spent like writing, rhyming couplets.
For the people, because one thing that I realized over the last few years running the show is that I've got a lot of artists and creators tuning in. I think that might be my core audience, actually. But indie creators trying to get trying to break in, trying to get their books off the ground. What is the process like when you're pitching?
Well, I mean, aside from all the mechanics of sort of like, talking to knowing an editor, or like, how to send it in, how to send something in or get it there. I mean, first, I sort of feel like there's a sense of like wanting to embrace the idea that you have to do a lot of stuff that you kind of consider hacky. Everybody wants to have this story that's so original and so new, and and like the old X plus Y, log line, like, oh, it's a C-3PO and Blade Runner or whatever, like that kind of that kind of stuff is hacky. I mean, it can be very hacky, but it also is like, sometimes it's important to just sort of to tell people like, okay, it's like this familiar thing, but different in these ways, instead of having to explain the whole thing to them, and they're like, oh, that sounds like Blade Runner, or whatever, that sounds like The Mandalorian. You're like, yeah, but it's underwater or whatever, and so like I think sometimes there's this sense that you have to sort of embrace some of the things that can be sort of a little bit annoying about, or that seem a little Hollywood or whatever. In order to tell people what's different, you have to kind of show what's also the same. And then I mean, I always like to make in a sense, I'm a writer artist. It's different than it would be for one or the other, but I think I always try to make like a really pretty full-fledged pitch that shows all the characters and shows all the environments and shows a few like would-be panels. They might not like, literally be panels from the story, but like what they would look like, and this storytelling style, lettering style, coloring style, if you happen to know, just to give people as much information as possible. And and of course, like, you have to be ready to change a lot of stuff if people are like, oh, we'd like to have a different lettering style, or we'd like to be able to have it, we'd like to have the word balloons not on the art so that we can swap it out for French editions or whatever, things like that. I mean, you want to be light on your feet, or you want to know where to stick to your guns. Like I tend to kind of stick to my guns on lettering a lot, because it's like, lettering's part of the art. Don't make me draw 50 buildings in the background that are going to be covered by a word balloon. Like, that's annoying. And also it makes the book late. But yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of sort of like establishing priorities and all that. So
when a publisher is publishing your creator-owned stuff, how much pushback are they able to get? Do they get like?
Yeah, I mean, I guess a lot of it comes down to personalities. Like if the editor is very forceful, there's probably, you're going to be like, all right, I don't want to fight about this. But and I also think I felt like I didn't get a lot of editorial pushback on Kaijumax, because one, I was a one-man band, essentially. I mean, I was working with Jason, but it was like, it's not like if they knew that they just left me alone, the comic would come out. And so I think that there was a lot of like, okay, my energy is better spent elsewhere. And I wasn't doing awful things, I wasn't doing racist things or whatever hopefully in the comic. So it was, I think that an editor probably could insert themselves a little bit more in a chain of 4 people doing it, and sort of say like, hey, I read the script, maybe we can tweak this and this and this. when I wasn't even turning in scripts because because I was under the gun all the time, and so I was just doing layouts with
Oh, you were going straight to the page.
oh yeah, oh yeah. There's no way. I mean, I wrote one script for the very first issue, and then and then I would always just turn in basically a very rough layout, story that would have dialogue basically in place for balloons.
That is interesting because I talked to writer artists who still full script for themselves as if they were writing for someone else, like J.H. Williams. And I'm like, but you know what's gonna happen.
Although, I mean, his stuff is so labor intensive and so detailed that I can imagine that he would be like, I don't want to get anybody like, I want to get this completely set in stone so that I know that I don't have to like do any editing in the art stage.
Yeah.
That would be my guess. And I mean, I also think, if he's doing Batman or something like that, or Batwoman or something, that they're gonna have notes and say, oh well, Kate Kane can't do this because XYZ is happening in this other Bat book or whatever. It would be my guess, but I don't know. I mean, with Kaijumax, which of course is its own self-contained universe, I don't know why bother. Why bother like messing up my flow if it's not affecting anything else in the whole.
So would you say that if you were working on a corporate owned comic, you would have to turn in a script? That would be the process?
For sure. I mean, I think when that was the other thing. I did a Spider-Man story. I did a Spider-Verse story for the Edge of Spider-Verse, which is just basically like little mini stories from the various Spider universes. And I turned in a script that was pretty detailed, but I also turned in layouts because I just figured, well, I always feel like if I have something in mind, I might as well tell people. And it's like, change it if you got something better in mind. Absolutely. But here's something that would work for me. It all fits on the page. All the lettering fits and stuff like that. So I definitely turned in a full script, and then they actually reformatted it because there's a very specific Marvel formatting.
I kind of feel like it's the most Zander Cannon-y thing that I asked you everything that you worked on this year, and Spider-Verse is the one you forgot.
Yeah, that's my bad. It's a mess. I'm a mess this morning. So
well, it's not that. I think it just kind of I think it kind of highlights that I think you see all of these stories kind of equally. It's not that because I feel like Spider-Verse at this point, any specific Edge of Spider-Verse issue could blow up at any given point in time, depending on who they put in a movie, right?
Right. Oh, that'd be cool. Yeah. Mine was like a murderer. I love it. Like a murderous sort of creature. So I like the idea that would be in a movie.
That would be pretty cool. I'd like to ask you about something that you commented on a couple months ago on my Facebook, actually, if you remember. I posted about Scott McCloud's 4 camps.
Oh yeah.
So his whole idea is that there are 4 types of creators. There's the classicists like Hal Foster, who are just really in it to produce really beautiful work. There's the animists, and I think like his examples for that were like Hergé and Jack Kirby on Fantastic Four, where the whole idea is you're not really even aware that there's a creator because it's all about the story. Then there's the formalists, who are all about experimentation in terms of form, and then there's the iconoclasts, who are like, R. Crumb, who
or experimentation outside of the rules.
Outside of the rules, yeah.
I think that he used like basically Art Spiegelman's non-mouse work as an example of of an iconoclast, where it's like, it was formalism too. I don't know. I guess, but I mean, we know what we're talking about here. Like,
it's experimentation at the bottom there. It's a quadrant. So,
right. Yeah,
Like,
I don't remember what my comment was, but yeah, I really like. I mean, I like that diagram. I think it's an interesting idea, and it's interesting to sort of go like, oh, where are my favorite ones, and where were my favorite ones 10 years ago, and where are they now? You know, like because I think that in the '90s, I and a lot of other people were like, oh yeah, formalism is really interesting. Like Chris Ware was just knocking it out of the park, and then like Scott McCloud would have like basically his treatises, but then also he would sort of have formalist work that was really interesting to read. And um, but I think that people kind of drifted away from that and kind of got into more like, oh, I just want a rip roaring story, and
really?
that was more in the animist, which is almost like the opposite of that, the
Yeah,
animist sort of.
yeah, because you're right about Scott McCloud because he was one of the first people to really use a computer, right?
Mhm.
And also tell stories on online, which is interesting because when I look at things like webtoons now, it's very, very animist. It's just very straight to the story, right? There's
Yeah, well, and there's no like page. I mean, obviously you can sort of be a formalist anywhere, but like there's no page to sort of like play with. It's just this endless scroll of
Mhm.
stuff. And yeah, I think and I think that people, it's just a pendulum too, where you're like, oh, even because even the image, as much as image was sort of like, oh yeah, it's like this cool story, we weren't getting it for like the cool stories, because the stories were so at best. That sort of initial wave, it was, but we were like, oh my gosh, look at Jim Lee's artwork, oh my gosh, look at Todd McFarlane's artwork. I mean, it was formalism in a certain way. It wasn't like Chris Ware, but you were paying attention to those pages in that same kind of way, instead of uh, really needing to know, you know, I don't know,
Yeah.
really following the story as much. And then I think that there was a shift where it was like writers became sort of like the stars, because they would have these 25 issue runs on Fantastic Four or whatever that would really change up the universe, and uh things like that.
I'd
So I
like
don't know.
I'd like to
Yeah.
point out that you're mentioning early image and how the stories were so at best, and I just want to point out that in those early issues of Spawn, getting four good writers on it was a gimmick.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
So I think even he knew.
Right. Which is so, yeah, and it was so funny too how much money those artists made on those books too, where it's just they're like, all right. And then they get a check for like $120,000 or whatever, and it's like, oh, or more. I don't know. It was just an astonishing amount of money. And I
How
just
much of
remember.
that do you think is like lightning in a bottle? Because like the example that I like to go to is somebody like Jim Lee, who obviously can draw really, really well, right?
Mhm.
But I do feel that for the majority of his comics art, he sticks to a very specific type of range, which I know that
Mhm.
he can go out of if
Yeah.
he wanted to. So like, how much of that do you think? Um, yeah, like I guess my question is like, how much of that do you think is lightning in a bottle that could never happen again? Like, do you think if like somebody like Jim Lee came out like 10 years later, it would have had the same kind of impact?
I mean, well, and I think everything is an answer to what happened before, like because Jim Lee was kind of just like, he was just basically taking the reins from a Neil Adams or a John Byrne, where it's like, oh yeah, that stuff is beautiful, but it feels very 70s or very 80s. And he was sort of saying like, all right, let's take it up a notch, add a little sheen. Steve Oliff basically, of course, was redefining it just as well with the color that he was bringing to it.
Mhm.
And and let's take that stuff and polish it to this incredible sheen. And unlike so many of his people who copied him, he really had the fundamentals under it as well. Like he wasn't gonna like make a mistake in somebody's anatomy or whatever. And so uh I think that if he came 10 years later, I don't think that it would have the same effect, because it wouldn't be sort of like people going like, oh, he's part of this exact same, this march onward, this sort of like progression of semi-realistic adventure art, you know.
And in McCloud's little quadrant, where do you think you fall?
Oh, let's see. I used to be a formalist. I used to have some formalist instincts, but I think that uh, I try to be an animist. I try to be like I try to make the story and the experience of the story. Like I don't want anybody to sort of look at it in an academic way and go like, oh, very interesting what he did there. I want them to go, oh, I hate that character, or oh, I can't believe that happened, or like that's the experience. I want someone to have an experience that is not academic at all. I want it to be a very sort of like visceral feeling of joy or of sadness or of like disgust or whatever, like, but yeah, I think that that's the hardest thing that I've had to do because I didn't go to art school, but I mean, when you sort of look at things from a learning context of like, oh, I got to learn how to draw this and I got to learn how to draw that, you can accomplish some interesting things. But I feel like the idea of tying all that sort of stuff together into a thing and making it invisible is that's to me the big challenge and the most satisfying thing too.
Where do you think you shifted from being more of a formalist to more of an animist?
um I don't know. I mean, it was always there, but I also
Mhm.
think I think that once once I started doing layouts for like I mean, I was doing layouts for Gene, and then that kind of led to doing a lot of layouts for a lot of DC comics and Vertigo comics, Fairest and like Justice League and Superboy and Pandora and all this sort of stuff. And so I was cranking out these page layouts, and there's no time or appetite for doing something really wild, or like a triangular panel or anything like that. And I also sort of felt like I'm doing layouts for a lot of different styles of artists. There's it would be foolish of me to try to impose like a formal style or like tricks, like
Yeah.
comic book tricks on them when they may not have any intention of doing that. And usually they're like under the gun deadline wise. And so I really started to pare things back to make them, to make the page layouts very, very invisible and make it all about here is a composition that is unmistakable. You know exactly what's happening
Mhm.
here. This person has power over this person, and this person is observing this person. Like so that you can really you can tell without the dialogue balloons at all. And and I felt like that was a fun challenge for me, and I really, and I did it so much that I it became sort of part of my it became sort of like how I do everything now. And so that was the real shift. But I mean, I'm sure it was probably going to happen in one way or another.
You and I have talked before about how when you were doing layouts for Gene on Top 10, you realized that the way to tell that story is not to have that huge bass note, not to be, not to have those big money shots. And I feel like the result is a very, very straightforward telling of the story, which my brain wants to say is animist, but
Uh-huh.
I now feel like mentioning that out loud, where there was a conscious choice to not do that, is a formalist instinct.
And I think that you can't be all one or all another. I mean, but like I think that doing top 10, it's like I like other styles of storytelling for sure. Like I love in some uh like Alan Davis would do stuff that would where a character would kind of pop out, or like or things would be like kind of idiosyncratic, or they would drop out of background. But I felt like this story needed to have everything in the story was so weird and so strange and so much its own thing that it was really important to have uh backgrounds in every panel. Let's show off these gags and jokes and like sort of chicken fat in the background. And I think that for another story that would be boring, like if it were just sort of an ordinary story of somebody going about an ordinary life, that kind of storytelling would be like, well, why am I even reading this? Like that's so somebody who's going through an ordinary life, then you want to do something that is maybe like um is maybe like Chris Ware, you know, where it's like, oh, let's take a look at all of the other details around it, or like let's deconstruct it in a way that makes it kind of hard to understand this ordinary thing, or somebody like Peter Bagg, who makes it so absurd and over the top, even though it's just regular people going about their life in a regular way. You know, I felt like the story was so wild that I had to contain it in a way that was very clear what was happening, and very, you know, Scott McCloud says it's the is it like the car on a house shot where it's like, if there's a car that's like, you know, landed on top of a house, you don't want to do anything tricky with the composition. You just show the car in the house and people are like, wow, that weird thing happened, you know, and it's very clear that that's what's going on. So.
That particular wave of 90s indie comics, autobio comics, you know, Chris Ware obviously is amazing, and Peter Bagg is amazing. You know, all of these people are very skilled.
Right. Joe Matt, R.I.P.
Oh yeah. Dan Klaus.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do feel that despite all of the skill level, there was an undercurrent of how do I put this? Not liking life so much. Yeah. Did you feel that in the scene back then? Like,
oh yeah.
Did you feel?
Yeah, and I felt like people would read The Replacement God, my comic back then, and they were like, you know, like, what is this middle school bullshit that you're putting on us? Like, it's, you know, it's like a kid going on an adventure in a fantasy world. Like, it almost seemed like Lord of the Rings was, I mean, it was a book. It was just a book still. People knew about it, but it was kind of like, I don't know. It's all kind of D&D. It was kind of D&D stuff.
It's nerd stuff.
Yeah, nerd stuff or whatever. But it was also sort of like, it was this kind of obscure and like, oh yeah, fantasy movies just kind of didn't do anything. I mean, when Lord of the Rings was about to come out, people were like, I don't know if this is going to work. You know, like, you know, and of course it changed everything. But like back then it was like fantasy was, I don't know. I mean, I even had a slight distaste for it because it was like, oh, you know, you feel like you got to give like 200, you know, books of lore. You got to give the Silmarillion in the background or whatever. And yeah, and I mean, I would go to conventions and talk to these, you know, my heroes, these comic book heroes of mine, and they were kind of like, what book do you do? Oh, that one with the, you know, with like the Visigoths and stuff, and like it's, yeah, it kind of felt like it was like buying the wrong album at the cool record store. You know what I mean? Buying the Britney Spears album or whatever at the record store in 1998.
So that was just the zeitgeist at the time.
I think so. I mean, you know, and it happens all the time where it's like, you know, there's this backlash. Comics had gotten to be so shiny and like the color had like exploded and become, you know, and become these sort of like flashbang things, and so there was this backlash to saying like, oh no, we're gonna do like the, you know, this the grit and grime's got to be on the page, and you know, and you really got to show your drawing chops instead of doing, you know, sort of flashy superhero stuff.
Yeah,
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, it was weird to be. It was kind of in between those worlds, you know, where it was like, well, I want to do genre stuff, but I kind of wanted to draw it in a way, you know, that would get the approval of the indie guys.
that is the interesting thing, is like there's two people who were doing that in the 90s. It was you and Jeff Smith.
Well, yeah, it with varying degrees of success. Yeah.
Well, I was talking about lightning in a bottle earlier, and Bowen is definitely
right. And I mean, you know, and I mean, of course, and he was kind of bringing the animation aesthetic to it. I mean, and there were a lot of sort of copiers of that as well, where he was, you know, it's like so many bone pages are essentially storyboards for a 2D animated movie, you know, where characters are kind of interacting on the same plane, and there's not a lot, you know, there's very rarely a lot of you know, sort of depth, you know, like the depth would be sort of like reserved for sort of like, ooh, a mysterious moment at the end of a scene or whatever. And I think that was a big thing that he was doing that really caught people's attention, which is like, oh, you can sort of create this humor by basically aping the style of of Warner Brothers
Hmm.
cartoons, essentially, or
And
Disney.
that's where he came from. He came from animation.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think it's interesting that something like Bone would be very easy to animate, which is a shame about the Netflix cartoon. But so would your
yeah.
style. So like Kaijumax would be like super easy to animate. But I also don't feel like you or Jeff, and not that I want to speak for Jeff, but like so like I don't feel like you draw in such a way where you think like, oh, I'm definitely gonna make it so that it'll be easy to animate. And I feel like I
No,
see, yeah,
right. That's sheer luck, or or whatever. It's good luck or bad luck. I don't know, but I mean, it's a yeah. I don't intentionally do that, but I also think those were my influences. Like Don Bluth, like with Secret of Nim and An American Tale and Dragon's Lair and Space Ace, those, that kind of like loose Disney adjacent, style that's my, that's absolutely a humongous influence on me, especially on, Replacement God. And then, with Kaijumax, I think in a way it's like it's only now highly animatable because of differences, people animating in Flash or the equivalent of
mm,
Flash, because it's like right now all that Kaijumax stuff has so much little detail in it that 25 years ago that would be just a huge pain in the neck to animate, and now it would be trivial because it's just you add it and you just keep it for every panel. It's because it's done on computers.
and they're all like very very distinct character designs. And there's a billion of them, so you
Right.
can't.
Right. Yeah.
It would be
Yeah.
very hard to do and hand drawn.
Yeah, Jason Fisher counted them all. Like he said, there's like, if you count different versions of the same character, there's like 300 characters by the end, and I was like, that sounds right. I mean, I'll take your word for it. I don't know. Because I can't keep track of them all.
Well, I bring that up because I feel like I guess these have always existed, but I think that lately I'm seeing a lot of, how do I put this? Comics that look like they're meant to be pitches.
Well, yeah.
The,
The cynicism has always been there in one form or another, don't you think?
well, I don't know if the cynicism is coming from comics look like they're coming from pitches, or the cynicism is coming from me thinking that they're no,
No,
that they
no,
look
I
like
think it's coming
pitches.
from comics. I think that, and I'm sure that there's a lot of people who wouldn't necessarily go that way, but but they have a uh, like an agent or a manager or a collaborator who's like, we got to make this so that it's, if nothing else, we could just pitch it as a TV show as well as a comic. And that's, it's smart in a way, but it's also too bad. It's too bad in that it just seems to devalue comics, like that comics aren't good enough. Um, and granted, they
And
don't pay well enough. Like I'll say that. Like it would be great. It would be great to get that TV money, but yeah, it is too bad. And I also think that it's not seeing what comics can do that nothing else can do.
right, right.
You know?
It limits what the comic is doing
Yeah,
from
yeah.
the start.
And that's the formalism thing that I like to retain, is that like I want to pitch something that works best as a comic, and it might work differently and maybe just as well in another form, but it works, but I'm making it as a comic first. Like, so for example, Kaijumax I think it works great as a comic because there's a lot of characters, but you can read it as slow as you want, and but there's also like a lot of like puns and visual puns and like character designs that emulate other things. And so if you can look at it slowly, or at your own pace, you get a lot of that stuff. But I think it would work in an interesting, different way in animation, because then it's like, well, then you can start having people's voices and accents, and
Yeah.
you'd have to maybe dial back some of the intense like monster slang that's maybe too deep a cut. But then you could like make different references and different, oh, like a Jersey Devil would have like a New Jersey, like, hey, what bada bing kind of accent, like that's the thing that you couldn't do in comics. It would be absurd, but you could do it in this, and like really start, having have an interesting set of like, oh, this is a worldwide phenomenon and people are coming from everywhere, type of thing. So I
You,
kind of like the idea of like making things for one medium and then adapting them to another medium and finding what's good about each one.
Retaining the story, but the texture and the details will optimize
Yeah,
it for that particular medium.
right. Yeah. So anyway,
Yeah, I
yeah,
think
that's the formalism still in me. I can't get rid of it entirely.
yeah, I think my example of that is like the Watchmen movie from 2008, where I'm like,
Hmm.
this isn't a comic that's meant to be filmed shot for shot, but that's
Right.
exactly what it did. Like, there's
Well,
nothing here
definitely
that
not
only
in
movies can do.
right, and not in 2 hours, especially. Like I think that it would be an interesting exercise, but not very interesting if they shot it as a 12 1 hour, TV shows. I mean, I would have been
Mm,
more into that, but I also think, well, we have that, and it's
yeah,
not like and it's not like Watchmen is a hard comic to read. Like it's an extremely engaging sort of like page turner, and there's a lot of extra stuff that you miss, but you'll get the story, like it's a very much a crowd pleaser of a story. uh
yeah.
you
What
know
when I was younger, I was like, I definitely want to see comics adapted exactly as is, and then I saw the animated version of The Dark Knight Returns, and I was like, why am I
oh,
watching this? This is exactly the same. I've
right, right. I mean, I felt the same way, but yeah, like I mean, they've adapted Batman Year One, and my favorite Batman comic of all time, maybe one of my favorite superhero comics of all time. And I'm like, I don't really feel like watching it because it's like the comic is perfect.
it's
There's no reason for me to like kind of, I don't know, dilute that by
it it
watching.
it brings nothing to your experience of
Yeah,
Batman Year One. It's exactly the same, right?
right. It's just for people who don't want to read comics. Which that's fine. That's also fine. I mean, there are a lot of people who don't want to read comics. I like my, you know, not Batman, but I mean, my wife would be like, "Oh, I don't necessarily want to read this comic so much." But like, yeah, well, it's a half-hour show. Let's watch it. And I think that's fine. When they adapt a novel, I'm happier to watch the novel and or to watch the movie than to read the novel. I don't know. Sometimes you just
I'm a little surprised that you mentioned Year One is your favorite Batman comic of all time.
really
I'm a little surprised, but I'm also kind of not surprised because I feel like Mazzucchelli is 100% in your wheelhouse. But I
kind
think
of.
the formalist side of the side of me that thinks of you as a formalist would have expected it to be Dark Knight Returns.
I love Dark. I mean, like it's a dead heat, kind of, but Batman Year One to me was, I mean, it came out when 86, 87 maybe, and so
Hmm.
I was probably 14, and so that's when I was really like, oh wow, like what can comics do? And so, and I was learning how to draw, and it's like, oh, he seemingly, just like effortlessly makes all these people that look like real characters, but they also look like cartoon characters, and it's like, and everything is sort of perfectly done in 11 lines, and it was like wizardry to me. It still is, but like, um, but yeah, I mean, I don't think it really shows in any of my work now. Like, I think that my stuff is definitely is not, like me and Chris Somney are way apart from each other, as like people in the same age cohort or whatever. But like, yeah, like that was the thing that I was like, this is something that I don't understand how it's done, and I have to study it. And so I studied it and studied it and read it a million times.
Yeah, I mean, you say you don't see it in your work now, but I think you mentioned Chris Samnee. I can totally see how you're both diverged from David Mazzucchelli,
Yeah. Okay.
but
Yeah.
like in different directions.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think also like, I haven't done stuff that has like deep black shadows in a long time, for
Hmm.
7, 8 years. And so like, yeah, it's like I completely did something else where it's like, oh, my black and white originals have no black areas on them. Like it's all just line art, and I did
Ah,
everything in color. Uh, and which is an interesting experiment. And then to go back, I just did an illustration that was all like sort of deep shadows, and in that sort of Alex Toth, David Mazzucchelli, Chris Somney style. And I was like, ooh, this is hard. Like I forgot how to do it. It's neat. It looks good, but it's like, ooh, it's hard. It's like you got to plan, and it's terrible.
my favorite David Mazzucchelli book is Asterios Polyp, so I don't think I
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I don't think I associate, as weird as it is, I don't think I associate David with heavy blacks. So I think that
Hmm.
that's why I can still like I associate him with paring down of everything.
Yeah,
So the
yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, yeah, Serious Polyp is I and Rubber Blanket when it was coming out, like,
just
that
still
was.
not collected anywhere.
Oh yeah, well, I've got my copies that, like, just hoarding them. No one can have them. But yeah, I mean, like reading that Discovering America, or discovering the map making one that was in Rubber Blanket, where he
Hmm.
did one plate was red and one plate was green, and then when they intersected, it was a brown. So it's like he made this three color thing with two mechanical plates. you know, yeah, it's one of those things where you're just like, well, I don't know how he did this. Yeah, it drives you nuts.
It drives me nuts because, in addition to being one of the most talented artists and storytellers who's ever lived, he also very clearly thinks about production.
Mm-hmm.
Like, don't you have enough on your plate?
Right, right. Well, yeah, I mean, like for somebody who has such a sort of uh like a documentary type style, like everything, things aren't so formally composed. He
Hmm.
does think about things in a very formal way, like especially this production type of stuff, and but yeah, like you read it and it's like, oh yeah, I mean, you kind of feel like someone's just following someone around with a camera. Like it doesn't feel, it's not like uh uh Dave Gibbons, who, where everything sort of feels very composed and very
Oh
sort of,
yeah,
you know, on a grid or whatever.
precise.
Yeah,
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 that's my word for Dave Gibbons is precise.
yeah.
But um, you mentioned that when you're doing stories for yourself, you don't even write a script anymore. You just go straight to the thumbnails. Can you give, for aspiring artists and storytellers watching this video, can you give any tips as to how you compose a story? Like, what is the first thing that you kind of, anchor, for example, an issue on or a storyline on?
Um, well, when I was doing Kaijumax, I would end up doing a lot of stuff that was kind of like, it wasn't necessarily saving time, but it was like making the best use of my time, because I would be like, I don't like I would start by be like, I don't know where this issue's going, or like I know what storylines have to be advanced, but I don't know what this issue is about. And so sometimes I would just say, all right, well, I'm going to start with, like, I know what the opening scene is, and so I'll just kind of figure that opening scene out. And then, like, you kind of look at that and you're like, okay, see what's been set up, see what questions have been asked in the opening scene. And you kind of think, well, the opening scene questions should be answered by the closing scene answers.
Hmm.
So that, and that's a satisfying issue, generally speaking. And then so then I can kind of look at that opening scene and see what was set up, and then go, all right, well, let's think about, like, what's the twist or the big moment at the end, and let's build backwards from that. And so, like, when I was kind of under the gun, that was how I would work on it, where it's like, okay, well, here's a 6-page opening scene or whatever, and then here's a 8-page closing scene, and it's like, well, that's 14 pages, and so now I only have 8 pages left. So I just get so then you have a sense for the scope of what the middle is like. And and once you have this ending that you're like, well, it answers the questions of the opening, but it needs a little bit more context. Then you're like, well, I have 4 items of context that I need to provide, so I'm gonna have to put them into the middle scene somewhere, and then you have to think of something interesting that's going to happen in the middle that will provide that context. And so, I mean, in a way, that was sort of my emergency style. Like, obviously there were times when I had more time and I could kind of think more like that. But I also felt like this emergency style was pretty good at getting a decent story across, um, without too much sort of connective tissue or fat in the story. Like it was all pretty lean and powerful if you were like, great opening scene, great closing scene, and then, like, provide the context in the middle.
Yeah, the thing in the middle is to get you from point A to point B.
Yeah, and I mean, and when you only have 22 pages to deal with, you have to make sure that you're really hitting the ground running. You're not sort of spinning your wheels in the middle, you're really getting things going. And and then yeah, nobody wants to read a story where you're just sort of like advancing somebody's life by by X hours. They really want to know, like, oh, it either needs to ask a question or answer a question generally. And so that was always my thought, where it's just like, oh, okay, yeah, like anyway, I'm just gonna repeat what I said.
There are 300 characters in Kaijumax, and none of them sounded alike. They were all very distinct voices. How do you write dialogue?
Well, I would watch a lot of for the prison, like and of course this isn't the same for everybody, but it's like, so I wanted to have the words that they're speaking have like a prison cadence, so I would listen to a lot of, like, there's a lot of YouTube channels of people who just got out of prison, and it's like, oh, this is how we made this this kind of ramen in prison. But then they would sprinkle in a lot of slang, or the way that people would talk, or the things that they would talk about in prison. So I get a lot of like dialogue, little snippets from that. And of course, then I have all the monster movie stuff. So then there's like, oh, okay, we could adapt that prison phrase to kind of reference Rodan or something like that. And then and so then I would write a bunch of phrases down that I kind of wanted to work in, like almost like Mad Libs. And then but dialogue too, like, I also sort of had to feel like characters had to have a way of speaking and a philosophy of speaking that always was consistent. And so, like, a lot of times I would write out dialogue without any of the funny little gags or the slang or any of that stuff. It was just sort of like, it's just from the personality of this person. So, like, they would say, oh, I'm not so sure about this, and then later on I would add in a gag or something to their phrasing, just so that you would get like the buildup of this scene without kind of worrying about showing people how clever you are. Whatever, you just sort of build up to the moment, and then cut away, and then you go back and sort of sprinkle in all that stuff. But I felt like it was really important to get like characters' personalities in there before you started doing too much whatever pyrotechnic, like dialogue pyrotechnics.
It's interesting that you said you went to YouTube channels, and as well as the stuff you already know from monster movies and stuff. And I feel like it never even occurred to me to use like YouTube as research for things like dialogue. And I'm like, right. Well, there's so many resources out right now. People really don't have an excuse for not doing any research.
Right. Well, I recently read a comic where it was set in the 40s or whatever, and somebody called someone else an asshat. And I'm like, come on, you gotta know that's like 2008. Like, and so yeah, like I just sort of felt like, yeah, like there's plenty. I mean, there's movies set in the 50s. Just watch those movies, see how they insult each other then, like
you bum.
you bum. Yeah. So you account, whatever. But anyway, so but yeah, like I think that I really like to get a voice going for a character so that I know how they talk, because it's like, otherwise everyone just talks like me, which is pretty boring after a while. Like some characters do talk like I talk, or they express themselves in that way, or compulsively explaining things, or being a little
it's appropriate for some characters.
All my weird little verbal tics, and it's like, well, that's boring if it's more than one character, or two, a character talking to another character. That's boring. So you want to have somebody who, I got this from Cerebus of all places, but like the idea that you would have characters, that you would really pay attention to how characters interact with other people, like, because he had talked about Dave Sim in some letter column or whatever, it talked about how like Lord Julius, Groucho Marx, which of course he didn't make this character up, but like would dominate conversations by sort of like by creating his own his own reality on top of what people had said, especially, you know, if people had phrased things in a certain way. And it's like, oh yeah, like it's really interesting when you kind of start to realize like, oh, this person dominates conversations in this way. Oh, this person dominates conversations in this way. Oh, this person is always in the background but has a quip, or you know, but people, or maybe this person speaks very little but people defer to them because that they're important. And I think that when you're always kind of keeping that stuff in mind, it really is, it makes not only writing those people interesting, but it also makes people go, oh, I would really be interested to see person X talking to person Y. And that's,
Yeah.
when you build that expectation, it's like, oh, well, half my work's been done for me. The people are already excited about it.
Would you say, you know, going back to McCloud's thing, would you say Gene is more of a formalist, I mean, a classicist or an animist?
I think that I mean, you know, he's a classicist in a certain way, which is that he has this compulsion to make everything, you know, so like
Pretty.
perfectly rendered, like beautifully rendered. I mean,
Yeah.
I wouldn't put perfectly on him, because I don't feel like that's a fun thing to try to do. But but everything is so beautifully rendered that I think that he has this classicist in him that he probably would like to get rid of a little bit, like, or that he would like to not be beholden to. Um, but yeah, like I think that when you read his work, it's very animist. Like read May, and it's like, oh yeah, it's this exploration of these people, and I mean and he deeply researches what he's doing, but he also wants the story to be a rip roaring yarn. He's not interested in sort of like, you know, saying I'm deconstructing what superheroes or fantasy worlds mean, you know.
Yeah, because I asked that question because I was gonna ask, do you think the animism is where the two of you intersect? Because I always am fascinated by your partnership because you draw so differently.
So differently, yeah, right, because yeah, I mean, he comes from an illustration background. He was going to be, I mean, I won't speak for him, but I think that he basically was like an illustration major, you know,
Mhm.
before he did comics. And that was not my, you know, it's like I do some illustrations, but they're always comic booky or cartoony styles. Yeah, and I think it is in sort of like the telling of fun stories that we intersect, because it's like, yeah, I mean, I've tried to draw like Gene. It's not going to happen. He's too good. I mean, he's too good, and he's also so precise that it's like I can't do that kind of stuff, and I don't care to. It's not fun. It's not fun for me to get the muscle striations exactly right. It's just, you know, I'd
Yeah.
rather, yeah, because I'd be in the middle of doing it, and I'd want to put like something funny in there, you know, like the butterfly in the background, you know, that's vomiting. I don't know, whatever. Like, but yeah, like, but I do think that it's interesting, yeah, where we intersect, and it's not in our art styles at all.
It's so. Would you say it's more of a mental thing?
Yeah, I mean, and the type of stories that we like to tell, and you know, I mean, we were really, you know, we were really dialed in together on Top 10, because I think that we wanted to tell the same kind of story, you know, something that was grounded but absurd. And you know, and he was like, oh yeah, and I've got all this knowledge of like, you know, obscure science fiction stuff, and it's like I've got all this knowledge of obscure like animation stuff, and like, yeah, let's put it all together, you know, and tell this story that's not like any of those things. um
So I think my question for that is again for up and coming artists, writers, and collaborators.
yeah.
How would you advise them if to get through creative differences? Because we've seen the words creative differences used a
Yeah.
lot to end partnerships.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that you got to make good choices in terms of your collaborators. And I mean, and like you say, Gene is a completely like counterintuitive choice for me. And it happened by pure happenstance, you know, by being friends, you know, not even by sort of like, we weren't at the same point in our career. We weren't, you know, anything. So, I mean, there's luck involved, but then, I mean, creative differences, I think that when you are having problems, the thing that you want to do, and Gene and I also did this, is that you just clearly define what everybody does. You know, I think that if you're having trouble and you're clashing on things, you have to, one, admit that like this isn't going to be exactly what I think it's going to be, and it's not exactly going to be what they think it's going to be. So let's define what we're doing, and do it in an order, so that like, yeah, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to set it up for you, and then it's your ball there, from there you can run with it. So like, because Gene and I would collaborate on pages in Top 10, and my sort of composition style and his illustration style, my composition style, which was pretty loose, and his illustration style was pretty tight, had problems, collaborating. And so me getting back pages that he had changed of my stuff was frustrating, because it's like, well, I don't even know where you're going with this. And so what we decided to do is just like, all right, well, I'm going to do the layouts on these pages. You're going to do the finished artwork. You take more of the page rate, and I'll take less of the page rate, and I'll just be able to work faster, and it'll keep the book moving. And so that was one of the things we did, and I think that made everything a lot happier. And we've collaborated since, where it's like, I'll do layouts, he'll do finished artwork, and then I'll do lettering. And then that's kind of fun too, because it's like, oh, if I felt like he was maybe being a little bit unclear, if he moved things around, that's okay, because I can sort of accommodate that with lettering, that sort of like that gets me back to what I was hoping to do. You know what I mean? So, yeah. Also, be nice. I think it's important to be nice.
It sounds to me like a lot of it is about keeping your egos in check.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it, and I think also just knowing that, like, yeah, the thing that you've got in your head, you got to let it go at a certain point. I mean, it's good to keep things. It's good to keep those dreams and keep those perfect things in your head, and do them, and maybe save them for a solo project or something like that.
Zander, in your experience, how often are you able to, in fact, execute the thing in your head so that it looks like the thing in your head?
If you'd asked me that when I was 25, I would say 3% of the time. If you ask me that now, it's like, obviously as I do it, it changes in my head a little bit, but it's close now. It's close, because being better, learning how to do everything for Kaijumax meant that, like, all of a sudden I'm not limited by like an arbitrary sort of like, oh, I don't know how to color this or whatever. It's like, then I can kind of like, I can attack it from every angle when I'm doing something. It's like, oh, I can kind of think about the colors as I'm doing things, and kind of pop in some colors and work around that. And so I think things kind of look, 90% what I think they're going to look like. Maybe they're not quite as good. But it's funny, because it's like, I never would have guessed that, 20 years ago. I would have been like, oh yeah, well, I'm just gonna have to be happy with 30%. And it's like, no, it actually gets pretty high. But you also know how you draw, and you know what you can do.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think that maybe my imagination has sort of like taken it down a peg and gone like, he's not going to be able to do anything better than this.
Do you ever feel like you've peaked? Like, or do you? Yeah.
I think in a couple ways. I mean, a couple metrics. Like, I remember a couple years ago, I remember thinking to myself, what did I want to accomplish when I became a comic book artist? And I was like, oh well, I wanted to be, I wanted to have books on the shelf, something I could be proud of, things that I could point to and say, this is what is inside me. This is what I wanted to make, and this is what it was, and it's pretty close. I wanted to be sort of like, well known enough or respected, like, to sort of like the people will go like, oh yeah, that guy pretty good, he's a good artist, or like, oh wow, I read your book and I really loved it, or stuff. That's like, well, that that's happened here and there. And then I wanted to make enough money to live, and that's what I'm still working on.
Is there enough money in comics to live?
Oh, I mean, you can try my method, which is to marry somebody with a middle-class job, and that is real helpful. I I didn't think there's money, but it's like, it goes up and down and up and down, like, what did Phil Hester said, it's like an echocardiogram, like, it's just up and down and up and down and up and down. So yeah, so there's that. I mean, so there's a nice sort of feeling when you're like, I've plateaued in a way where it's like, oh yeah, I'd love to do more books, but I don't need, and I'd like them to make some money, and I'd like people to like them, but I don't need to be, on a talk show or be a household name. I wouldn't want to do any of that stuff. So I've plateaued in a way that I enjoy, in terms of fame and accomplishment.
But in terms of
just
skills, you think you're still getting better?
uh maybe. I think that I have peaked or I've gotten to the point where I'm like, I don't feel like I want to get any better or any different in this particular medium, basically line art. Like
Okay.
that's about it. Like I don't feel like I'd want to change it up or be better in any way. But if I were to change over to sort of a more painterly style or like a vector graphics type of style, then I would maybe, then that would be really fun to sort of like get better and better and better with that. But probably peaked in terms of in terms of line art, because I have no interest in getting any better. I just want to get faster.
Well, faster
Yeah.
with no loss of quality is better.
Yeah. Right.
Right.
So yeah, so I got a hard question. That's my 15-minute answer for that.
The last time we spoke, you mentioned that you were in talks with some studios for Kaijumax. How's that going?
It happens sometimes, during the pandemic, of course, everything slowed down because we weren't going anywhere in person. And then also during the strike, the writer's strike, you couldn't do any of that stuff. I'm not part of the guild or anything, but nobody who was could be part of that, and they couldn't take, and you never want to be a scab. You never want to scab, even if you may one day become part of that union. And so now that that's over, there's something, things may start happening again. So we'll see. I mean, and I also think Kaijumax, not everybody knows everything about Kaijumax, but it's like it's a look back on monster movies. Like it's acknowledging all the silliness, and it's sort of like early on we were pitching it to people and they'd be like, "Ooh, kaiju, yeah, Godzilla's hot. We want to make our own, like, we want to have our own Godzilla that we could make a straight monster movie out of." And it's like, that's not what this
That's
is.
not what Kaijumax is about.
Right. And maybe it's a couple of years before you kind of instinctively understand what this is, which is like, it's a very cynical look at that stuff. It's you after watching 500 monster movies in a row going like, all right, I got it. Like, I get it now. All right, now what can we do with it now that's still funny and interesting? And so I think that in the 5 years that since we started pitching it, I think that maybe things like that could start to happen.
Do you think maybe it's because, and I don't know why this is, but when a genre of movies tends to take off, eventually there's something that makes fun of it. Right?
Yeah.
Like, so
Right.
we had all of those like horror movies, and then, oh no,
Right.
not another scary movie, that kind of thing.
That's what Kaijumax is. In my heart, it's just not another scary movie.
But or superheroes.
No, I agree.
Obviously.
I agree with you. I think that's funny. That's what I aspire to.
But like, I mean, for whatever reason, kaiju movies have tended to be kaiju movies. Like, they're, I know what I'm getting into when I'm watching Godzilla versus Kong. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Like, it's not going to be ironic.
Yeah, that's it. It's not gonna be ironic.
Yeah, I mean, it's like they either are for kids, or then somebody is like, oh no, it's a special effects master, like tour de force, and that's what it is. But it's not. But I mean, other than sort of like Shin Godzilla being like, oh, let's talk about bureaucracy, or like, or like some indie movies like Big Man Japan, sort of talking about whatever that movie was talking about. Yeah, like, I don't think. Well, certainly, I think Kaijumax is a pretty unique concept. I mean, it's built on a lot of the same stuff that you've seen everywhere, but the idea, it deals with kaiju in a way that I don't think that we've seen much of.
It also deals with prison in a way that you don't see much of.
Right. That people wouldn't dare to do. Well, that I wouldn't dare to do in an sort of uninflected way. Like what would I have to say about real prisons in America with people in them? Like that would be like credible, because it's like, well, I'm just sort of a middle class person who's never been to prison, who's never been arrested.
Yeah.
What would I have to say? What would I have to say about it that would be really all that relevant? But if I can kind of just say like, oh, okay, now let's heighten it by literally and figuratively, and make it into monsters in prison. It's like, well, then I can kind of talk about more general things about power and lack of power and whatever, addiction and that kind of stuff.
Zander, what do we have to look forward to in the foreseeable future as you work on your big pitches?
Well, yeah, I don't know. Everything in the spring of 24 is up in the air, and I don't know what is going to be happening. I don't know if I'm going to have a project to do. I don't know if I'm going to have a job, like a job at a publisher or something. I don't know. There's a lot of potential things that might happen, and I wish I could even narrow it down. But there will be comics coming out for me in 2024. That I guarantee.
I believe there's a Rick and Morty story coming out soon.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's another thing. Like Spider-Man, I forget. Like I'm doing a Rick and Morty one shot. Sorry, that'll be out in December.
Well, are you writing it, or did you draw it? Or?
I just drew it. Rafer Roberts, he's an indie creator, wrote it. It's really funny, and it's called Rick in a Box, which right. No, groan, please, groan. It's the worst, but like it's it's somehow relevant. I don't know, but anyway, it's very fun. It's a very funny story, and it's
I'm not groaning so much as I can't believe you went there.
Yeah, I didn't.
Yeah.
Or, well, I mean, I'm along for the ride, but yes, we went there. So, but yeah, and you'll see why they asked me to do it. Like as soon as you have, you'll be like, all right, yeah, I get it.
Okay. I can't wait. There's a Batman family comic on Webtoons.
Okay.
Right. And then one of the episodes is literally Dick Grayson is holding a gift box, and Bruce goes, "Hey Dick, what's in the box?"
See, that's worse. I
can't believe you went there.
Right. I mean, just calling the story that, whatever. It's too far. No,
every Gen Zer watching this right now has no idea what we just talked about for the last 2 minutes.
You're not Gen Zers. Let me give you this message. You're not missing anything.
Zander, do you have anything else you want to plug or mention, or anything you want to boost?
Well, buy indie comics. Support your local comic store. Say nice things to your local cartoonists. I don't know.
Have you?
I got nothing to plug.
Have you? What do you think of crowdfunding, like Kickstarter and stuff? Like, I'm surprised that I don't see you on it.
It's like I need to get a project going. It's like after Kaijumax, it's like that's when all that stuff rose up, and I was like, I didn't need it at the time, and so I'm kind of behind the times on that. That's something I've been looking into for a couple different projects, and again, that might be something that's happening in 2024. Who knows? I wish I had something better to say.
I would love to talk to you about it if anything materializes on those Kickstarters.
Right. Yeah, that would be great.
Thank you so much, Zander. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, always a pleasure.
Same time next year.
We'll do it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.